income distribution, which went along with that. But the other side of that was, of course, once the power of labour was broken, capital could engage in a politics of what we would call wage repression. And for the first time in American history, no gains in productivity actually went to benefit the working class. And wages essentially stagnated relative to all other forms of income. The share of wages in gross domestic product fell in nearly all of the OECD countries, and interestingly also the data on China shows the same thing. So, if you like, the share of labour, of wages in the national output pie was steadily declining from the 1970s onwards. And what that immediately created were a whole series of interesting kinds of problems. The first problem was if workers are not being better paid, then who's going to buy the product? This is sort of old Henry Ford. This is where you shift and you suddenly wonder about the effective demand problem. You've solved the labour problem now, which was the key difficulty in the 1970s. Are you now running into an effective demand problem? And there are various ways in which that was addressed, but one of the most important ways was to start to use the credit card kind of culture and start to encourage working class people to go into debt. So that household debt in the United States tripled from, say, around 1975 till recently. And the household debt is rising at an accelerating rate while wages are stagnant, and the gap, if you like, between the ability to support that debt and the volume of that debt is going pretty wonky. And that is, of course, one of the elements that led into the crisis in recent times. The second thing that happened was that capitalists themselves found themselves in a world which was much more competitive. You move from a situation of sort of cozy monopoly power to what capitalists sometimes call ruinous competition. So competition became much more intense during the 1980s and 1990s in particular. And when competition becomes much more intense, one of the things that happens is that actually puts pressure on prices, and that people cut prices in order to remain a competitive edge. And as a result of cutting prices, actually profits did start to go down in general. And this led into a very peculiar kind of economy in the 1980s, which was a low-wage, low-profit kind of economy. And this posed a certain problem because the capitalists are now accumulating vast amounts of money, thanks in part, of course, to Ronald Reagan's reform of the income tax structure, so that the top brackets who were paying, I don't know, 70 or 80% suddenly found themselves only paying 35%, something like that. So suddenly the rich are being much privileged by the tax reforms. But then the big question was, what were they going to do with their money? Now, Ronald Reagan's argument is, give the rich a lot more money and then they'll invest it. And that'll create jobs, and therefore we'll all be better off by giving the rich a lot more money. That was the argument, and everybody then, familiar, trickled down, or rising tide, or, rise all boats, all that kind of stuff. You know, that kind of rhetoric going on during the time. Now, the problem with this was that the assumption was that capitalists would actually invest in low-profit activities. And they didn't necessarily want to do that, and they started looking for ways in which they could invest in profits which were going to be easy profits. And so we start to find a whole set of investments which go into control over assets. Now, asset investments in asset markets work different from markets of widgets and automobiles. They work in such a way that they have a Ponzi character without necessarily a Bernie Madoff at the top. I mean, if I invest in property market, the property prices start to go up, and somebody says, yeah, investing in the property market is a good idea, I'm going to invest in the property market. And I would say, oh yeah, more and more. So actually more and more money pours into the property market, and the property starts to bubble. Same goes on with the stock market, with the new economy of the 1990s. The same happens with the art market, and then all kinds of other kind of peculiar markets form, commodity futures, currency futures. And at that point, the financial system, which has now been liberated from its earlier condition of repression, starts to create all kinds of instruments by which you can actually invest in those instruments and make a lot of money very fast in these monies, which is a sort of fictitious side of the economy, which is actually about, these asset bubbles. So what we get from the 1970s onwards is a series of asset bubbles which are absorbing vast amounts of capital, and out of which people are withdrawing vast amounts of capital. And then the question arises, well, what does that capital really mean? What does that money really mean? Who's backing it up? And all these sorts of questions start to arise in the 1990s. Is there anything real there? And so this is, if you like, the beginnings of the formation of the present crisis. Now, I've argued that actually working class people were being pushed more and more to go into the debt economy. And by the time you get into the 1990s, that has been extended to such a point that the problem of absorbing capital surplus starts to come into the picture. Now, part of my theoretical apparatus is to emphasize very much that throughout the history of capital, there's always been a capital surplus absorption problem. And the capital surplus absorption problem says, well, you've got to find profitable places to put your capital. Once you've got your profit at the end of the day, you start to reinvest. So you need to find a new place to go, and therefore the system has to expand. So there is therefore this mandate almost that growth becomes absolutely essential to the survival of capitalism, and growth at a certain compound rate becomes essential. So how is compound growth of a minimum of 3%, or better still if you do 5 or 7 or 8%, how could that compound rate of growth be assured when actually there's this sort of difficulty of finding real places to put your money? And part of the answer here, historically, has been urbanization. And since this is a metropolitan kind of thing, I'd better talk a little bit and integrate the urbanization. And this is actually a very significant thing. I learned this through the Paris study, that in 1848 there's a crisis of overaccumulation of capital, where the surplus capital and surplus labour side by side, and nobody knows what to do with it. And there is this major crisis which has political ramifications. A revolutionary situation breaks out, all kinds of mayhem goes on, and at the end of the day, they get this guy, Louis Bonaparte, who comes in and becomes elected president, and then declares himself emperor. Now, Louis Bonaparte was sufficiently smart to know that he wouldn't last very long as emperor unless he could put capital back to work and put labour back to work. Now, how was he going to do that? And I think what happened in Second Empire Paris is just a very interesting tale of how that was done, partly through an urbanization project. This wasn't the only thing going on. I mean, French capitalists started to do things like build the Suez Canal, build railroads down through, into Lebanon and all kinds of places like that. But the Paris reconfiguration was a big piece of it, and Haussmann was brought in to do that. Now, here's the interesting thing. In order to do this, you couldn't do it by just sort of letting money lie around in dribs and drabs everywhere. So one of the things that you needed in order to mobilize the money was a reform of financial institutions. And this always is significant. And as I've mentioned back in the 1970s, the reform of financial institutions was crucial to the revival of capitalism. Now, what happened was that the Saint-Simonians of the 1920s, 1930s argued that associated capitals were essential to creating magnificent public works and all the rest of it. And this was a utopian left project. People trained in that project came into the Second Empire situation and said, we have to find a way to associate capital. So they set up these new financial institutions, which are credit institutions, and these new banking institutions took small blocks of savings and assembled them in vast quantities, and then allowed that money to be poured into rather large-scale kinds of projects. It could be sort of building the omnibus system, the gas system, all those sorts of things. So the financial institution reform was important. The state finance part of that was also significant. And armed with that, they could then go on and rebuild Paris. And in rebuilding Paris, of course, they very soon found themselves with relatively full employment, and full employment which was associated with the full employment of capital as well. In other words, you created the opportunity for utilization of surplus capital through an urbanization project. And this was debt financed by these new financial institutions. And this was, if you like, a critical means that actually led into the revival of the French economy and the Parisian economy from the crisis of 1848.